them that keeps them engaged. On some deep level, the audience knows that we're all in the same boat and we're all heading in the same direction, and there's this thing that's being made that didn't exist before we, hundreds of people and the people in the stage, got together to make it, and we all own it, and let's see where it's going to take us. And that, I think, is, electrifying.
You're an engineer. You must know Euclid's axioms and common notions.
I must have in school, but...
I never had much of schooling, but I read Euclid in an old book I borrowed. Little enough ever found its way in here, but once learned, it stayed learned. Euclid's first common notion is this: things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. That's a rule of mathematical reasoning. It's true because it works. Has done and always will do. In his book, Euclid says this is self-evident. You see, there it is, even in that 2,000-year-old book of mechanical law. It is a self-evident truth that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. We begin with equality. That's the origin, isn't it? That balance, that's fairness. That's justice.
Can I ask you something, sir?
Sir.
What's it like after?
After?
This misery ends.
Hell or heaven? Like San Francisco.
A city. Good. I was worried it'd be a garden. I hate that shit.
Big city. Overgrown with weeds, but flowering weeds. On every corner, a wrecking crew. And something new and crooked going up catacorner to that. Windows missing in every edifice like broken teeth. Gritty wind. And a gray high sky full of ravens.
So, I'm surprised by this evening because my connection with the American Academy in Rome is really rather tenuous. I believe at some point in the 1990s, John Guare suggested that I should think about doing a residency at the Academy. When John tells me that I should read a book, I read it. When John tells me I shouldn't bother reading a book, sometimes I still bother reading the book, but so enormous is the esteem in which I hold the great Guare and his monumentally important body of work that the book he said I shouldn't bother with is usually spoiled for me. In nearly all things, I try to do what John says I should do because what serious playwright would disregard John Guare's advice? But even though John made the Academy sound like a paradise for artists, and even though I recall Adele Chatfield Taylor joining him and admonishing me to come to Rome and friends of mine found my reluctance to go puzzling even perverse. I'm an awkward, antisocial person and a pathologically reluctant, dilatory writer. John, Adele, and of course Rome itself stirred in me fantasies of mornings of unstoppable inspiration and industry fueled by espresso served by a handsome waiter in a nearby coffee bar, long, revitalizing walks in the Trastevere, and even longer, delicious, soul-stirring dinners with other writers and sculptors, composers, scholars, talking this stately midnight through until we stand at our great window looking at the dawn. But these fantasies had to contend against nightmares in which, after miserable mornings unhinged by too many cups of espresso served by an increasingly contemptuous, handsome waiter, paralyzed by the sounds leaking into my room through the floor, ceiling, and walls of other writers and artists, composers, and scholars hard at work, their pens scratching, keyboards clicking or tinkling, brushes and chisels daubing and hammering, and pages of books being rapidly turned, having been rapidly, painstakingly read and notated. After a long, pointless afternoon flight through the streets of the Trastevere, pursued by the Furies, I'd sit alone in some lovely dining room while at another table nearby, the Academy's other residents talked the stately midnight through, and some of their talk included whispering about me, that all I'd managed to do since arriving was compulsively shop for notebooks and pens in Roman stationery stores. The nightmares seemed like the likelier scenario given the given, so I stayed in New York and avoided writing by fantasizing about how much I'd be doing if I'd done a residency at the American Academy in Rome. My only other connection to the Academy, at least, involved setting foot on the actual premises in Rome nearly 20 years ago, when Maurice Sendak and I went to Italy for the purpose of driving around to see Piero della Francesca's in Urbino, San Sepolcro, Arezzo, and Monterchi. Maurice never learned how to drive a car, so I drove him to all these places from our headquarters near Cortona. I'm a terrible driver, and Maurice, along with his ferocious vitality, always had a serious death wish, so we made perfect traveling companions, especially since my poor sense of direction was outmatched by Maurice's rarely having any notion, once he'd left his house in Connecticut, where he was or how he'd gotten there. At one point, deciding that we were heading away from Monterchi rather than towards it, I tried to turn the car around, and I got both the front and back wheels unbudgeably stuck in Appian Way era stone rain gutters astride a one-lane road high up on a hill. And it was raining. It turned out that this road was the main traffic artery between wherever we'd come from and wherever we were heading. And soon a dozen lorries and their drivers on both sides of the car were marching around, shouting and gesticulating. Suddenly, a very, very old man in a white lab coat arrived on a motorcycle. The lorry drivers all stepped respectfully aside. He placed two large rocks in the gutters, wedged a piece of wood he carried in the pocket of his lab coat under the back wheel, got in the driver's seat, next to Maurice, who during the entire farrago had ignored the lorry drivers and refused to get out of the car. The old man in the lab coat put the car in reverse, floored the gas, and the car popped out of the gutters. I was afraid it might fall straight down the hillside, taking Maurice with it before we'd managed to see every Piero della Francesca in Italy, but it didn't. Maurice and I started out our trip in Rome, where we visited David and Susan Kurtzer, who were in residence at the Academy. Oscar Eustace, our mutual friend, introduced David and me after I'd read and adored The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara. I gave the book to Maurice, who also loved it, so we visited the Kurtzers at the Academy, and I believe we had lunch there. I'm not sure about that. I'm afraid I remember very little of the Academy except strong pangs of regret elicited by a general impression that the place appeared to be, as John Guare had told me it would be, a kind of paradisiacal. The Academy visit was eclipsed by our visit with the Kurtzers to the Protestant cemetery because Maurice wanted to visit John Keats' grave. Keats was Maurice's favorite poet, and when he put his hands on Keats's headstone, he burst into tears. 5 years ago, several months after Maurice died, I went back to Rome to do research for a screenplay I was writing for Steven Spielberg for a film that we're making now of the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara. I also bought a small Bakelite Mickey Mouse box containing some of Maurice's ashes to the Protestant cemetery. I poured the ashes into the ivy at the foot of Keats's grave. The first time I went to Rome, I hated it. For about 24 hours. In Fiumicino, right after I landed, I learned that back in New York, my favorite aunt had been diagnosed with cancer. So I was in a terrible mood, And I spent my first day in Rome on the phone to doctors, relatives, and airlines, arranging to return home. I walked out of the hotel in the afternoon, and I found the city noisy, abrasive, architecturally and historically incomprehensible, and overwhelming. I hated it. I went back to my hotel room to resume fighting with airline representatives with renewed determination to get out of this obviously overrated backwater of a city. The next morning, I woke up just after dawn, and I went for a walk before heading to the airport. I was crossing the Piazza di Santa Maria Maggiore when the rising sun crested the buildings opposite, and the basilica began to glow a miraculous, delicate autumnal gold. It was like an ecstatic vision. I was a medieval studies major in college, and for a moment I panicked, imagining having to explain to my poor Aunt Martha that I had a Pauline conversion in Rome. First, the diagnosis of cancer, and now this. But it wasn't a Pauline conversion, it was just a Roman morning. I spent the next hour walking around, still overwhelmed by the city, but now in a good way, surrendering to the incomprehensible and discovering in the process furtive moments of comprehension. I discovered in Rome's insane juxtaposition and superimposition and pentimento improvisations, revisions, and inconclusive erasures of history, a magnificent living external mirror of my own deeply convoluted, involuted, fluid and ossified, paralyzed, paraleptical, and endlessly distractible, digressive relationship to time itself. Rome, in that morning, became my second favorite city on earth, and I cherish and feed the fantasy, and perhaps, who knows, one day it'll become a reality of a residency there. I should probably hurry up and get over there while there's still a pope in the Vatican who doesn't inflame my atavistic anti-clericalism. Whether or not that happens, and whether or not, if it happens, it's at the Academy, I'm grateful to the Academy for the place it occupies in my imaginary landscape, and much more importantly, in reality. A home away from home for American artists and scholars in which the difficult work of attempting through creation and scholarly investigation to apprehend and or comprehend this overwhelming, often incomprehensible country of ours is supported within the all-important context of clarifying distance, of the self broadened by being a self abroad. The film of Lincoln is based on Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals. And by the way, maybe by way of illustrating the broadening of vision by looking abroad, I thought when I was working on Lincoln that nothing could possibly be more complicated than the American Civil War until I started working on the screenplay for Edgardo Mortara, and that compelled me to read about the Risorgimento, which I have completely given up any hope of really understanding. Doris refers to one of Abraham Lincoln's last letters as being perhaps the first mention by an American president of the possibility of government subsidization of the arts. He asks one of his secretaries in the letter to look into the possibility of America's foreign embassies offering minor positions without too many responsibilities to young men interested in becoming artists. Lincoln felt that undemanding jobs would give them time to develop as artists, development that he clearly felt would benefit from happening elsewhere, where one not only is a resident, but where one must, compelled by strangeness, by otherness, reawaken one's capacities to be a student. Lincoln casually envisioned this largesse as an aspect of the role government would play in an America reborn in and reconsecrated to equality and freedom. At home as he was with the conditional, ineffable nature of the democratic experiment and with the inexorability and inescapability of tragedy, Lincoln probably wouldn't have been surprised by the recrudescence of barbarism that today poses such a dire threat, not only to our democracy and to our union, but to all nations, to the globe itself. And I think he'd want me to pause here before concluding and give a shout out to yesterday's victorious anti-barbaric warriors of Virginia, New Jersey, Maine, and all across America. Having done that, I'll conclude by thanking the American Academy in Rome for its long and extraordinarily distinguished support of American arts and scholarship, mighty bulwarks against the barbarians. And Rome, of course, can tell us all a lot about the necessity and the consequences of failing to bulwark against barbarians. Thank you, Academy, and thank you, supporters of the Academy, for the work you've continued to do. And thank you for this lovely honor, for changing my tenuous connection with the Academy into something of great constancy, but howsoever strange and admirable. Thanks.